Hi, I'm Ted Morrissey, and this is a book launch via video for my new book, Delta of Cassiopeia. It is a collection of stories and sonnets. And so I want to tell you just a little bit about the book, maybe read a bit from the introduction, and read one of the first stories that appears in the book. So it's a collection, as I say, of stories and sonnets. Um, I've wanted to put a collection like this together for a while, and I finally have gotten around to doing it. My original plan was a little more modest, but the more I worked on it and thought about it, the more stories I kept adding to it, and so forth. And so it turns out to be 20 stories and 12 sonnets. The stories cover a time period from the early 90s until very, very recently. I think maybe 2019 was when I wrote the most recent story in this book. The sonnets run from about the year 2015 or 2016, somewhere around in there, to 2021. So there's some older stuff and some much newer stuff. I've organized the book into four sections. The short stories, which again there are 20 of those, I've carved those up into three sections. The most recent I'm calling my Crow Song stories, and those are stories that are related to my novel, which you can see, which you can see, Crow Song for the Stricken. After that novel came out in 2017, I was still interested in the characters and the world that I was kind of living in. So I wrote more stories along those lines, and those are among the most recent in the book. I also have transitional stories, and these are stories that aren't Crow Song stories, but they are distinctly different from the earliest stories in the book, which are in their own section, cleverly titled Early Stories. And then the fourth section of the book is the collection of sonnets, my Laertes sonnet sequence, which are sonnets written in apostrophe to my late father Vince. But as I say, I'd like to read a bit from the introduction and then read one of the stories that is in the Crow Song section. It's a little bit on the longer side, but I think still it'll be fine for the video, right? So again, 20 stories, 12 sonnets. The book right now is available in hardcover and in Kindle editions. You can either go to my website, tedmorrissey.com, or 12winters.com to find links for both the hardcover edition and the Kindle edition. And obviously, you can just kind of Google it and it'll pop right up. All right. So, again, I want to read a bit from the introduction. When I first kind of envisioned doing this book last fall, I thought, I'll put together 12 to 15 stories, write a pretty brief introduction. It'll be easy peasy. But the more I worked on it and the more I thought about it, the more and more material I decided I wanted to include in it. And consequently, the introduction got to be a little longer and more elaborate. So I've actually covered quite a bit of material in the introduction. I do talk about, obviously, the collection and sort of how it's organized and why it's organized in the way that it is. But I also talk about some of my thoughts on just writing fiction in general. I've been writing fiction pretty much my whole life, but I've been teaching creative writing for the last 35, 40 years. And so I have some thoughts on that, which I include in the introduction. And then I also kind of get into the history of short story publication in the 20th century compared to the way we kind of handle writing and publishing stories now. So again, a lot of material in there, but I just wanted to kind of pick it up part way through the introduction and talk at first about kind of how I came about putting the collection together, and also where I came up with my title, Delta of Cassiopeia. I write, for this collection, I've opted to keep the design simple. As you'll see, I view the contents as four distinct parts, and only a plain spoken design harmonizes with all four sections. For the cover image, I scrolled through thousands of my photos until I found one that I think captures the mood of the collection as a whole, including its title, which was a late choice. I had been considering an "and other stories" sort of title. Then I was rereading Ulysses. That's James Joyce's Ulysses, of course. I reread it often, in part because I teach a course in Ulysses. And a scene in Proteus seemed especially apropos to the spirit of this thing I was creating. In the episode, Stephen Dedalus is strolling along Sandymount Strand. Actually, at the moment, he is seated on a rock, when he is suddenly inspired to write a poem, which he scribbles on a piece of paper torn from a letter he is carrying. He thinks, "Whoever anywhere will read these written words, signs on a white field, somewhere to someone in your flutiest voice." The passage seems to capture the writer's need to write without knowing who, if anyone, will read their work. Ultimately, it is not the reading of it that matters, it is the writing itself. I also like Joyce's phrase, "in your flutiest voice," that is, your most poetic, your most musical, your most artistic voice. I'll return to this idea in a bit. Actually, I won't in this video, but I do in the introduction. Earlier in this same paragraph, Stephen, considering the image of his shadow on the beach, thinks, "Darkly they are there behind this light, darkness shining in the brightness, delta of Cassiopeia, worlds." Joyce refers to the constellation Cassiopeia and its delta 4 times in Ulysses, and in typical Joycean fashion, the image carries a complex of multiple and multiplying meanings. For me, though, in this moment on Sandymount Strand, Delta of Cassiopeia evokes the idea of the worlds created through fictive imagination, and the fact that these worlds, no matter how expertly drawn by the writer, will always come, in fact only come, to their fullest fruition via the participation of the reader. Behind every meaning deliberately constructed by the writer, there will be shadow meanings awaiting each individual reader. In fact, there are shadow meanings unknown consciously to writers themselves. By titling this collection Delta of Cassiopeia, I want to emphasize these key aspects of the writing-reading process, that meaning-making is a joint enterprise of the writer and reader, and that there are meanings in the text not even the writer is aware of. As my literary idol William H. Gass expressed it, "You hope that the amount of meaning you can pack into a book will always be more than you are capable of consciously understanding. Otherwise, the book is likely to be as thin as you are. You have to trick your medium into doing far better than you, as a conscious and clear-headed person, might manage." One of my pleasures in bringing together this collection has been reading pieces that I haven't looked at since the near miss of a collection in 2012, which I talked about a little earlier in this introduction, which was more than a decade ago. And then I hadn't read some of the stories in a decade or more. With the benefit of temporal distance, I see meanings and impetuses that were hidden from me when I was writing them originally. Oftentimes, it is truly like reading the work of another writer, and in a very genuine sense, I was another writer, another person. I also like the phrase Delta of Cassiopeia for the book's title because in the paragraph in which it first appears, Stephen Dedalus is compelled to write as if a slave to his creative process, to his muse, if you will. This is a phenomenon, a feeling, a compulsion that most writers understand. I certainly do. That is, I've written these stories and sonnets because I must. In essence, I had no choice in the matter. William Gass spoke to this aspect of the writing process as well, saying, "The contemporary American writer is in no way part of the social and political scene. Whatever work he does must proceed from a reckless inner need. The world does not beckon, nor does it greatly reward. Serious writing must nowadays be written for the sake of the art." I must underscore that Gass's "nowadays" was 1976. The situation has, as he describes it, has only grown more acute since then. Indeed, Gass famously quipped, well, famous in certain circles, that he hoped the novel he was writing, The Tunnel, quote, "will be such a good book no one will want to publish it." Already in 1971, Gass saw the handwriting on the wall. There was an inverse correlation between the quality of writing and the odds of finding a publisher, and that, of course, was due to the dearth of readers wanting truly well-written material. In the last half century, the situation has only gotten worse for writers of serious, challenging, experimental, avant-garde, artful, innovative books. Thus, I offer Delta of Cassiopeia to the world with the full understanding that in all likelihood, practically no one will read these stories and sonnets, at least not now. I will be upfront and acknowledge that one of my motivations for bringing out this work, as well as every other, is the hope that one day they will find an appreciative audience of more than a handful of readers. It may take decades or centuries or millennia, or it may never happen. Regardless, like Stephen Dedalus on the Strand, I'm compelled to keep writing, to proceed from my reckless inner need, as Gass phrased it. Right? And I go on from there in the introduction. But that gives you a little bit of background on kind of my thought process as I was putting the book together, and my hope that eventually these stories will find appreciative readers out there, even though it may take a while. So, as I say, I've got the stories, all 20 of them, divided up into 3 sections. Then there is the section of sonnets at the end. The first section in the book is the most recently written, so they're kind of in reverse chronological sequence. And these are my crow song stories. Again, these are stories that I wrote after finishing my novel Crow Song for the Stricken, that I was still interested in terms of the characters and the world they were living in and so forth. So I kept writing them, and I ended up writing 3 stories which were published independently. Then there was a 4th story that I wrote, which that actually propelled me into writing my next novel, which I call The Strophes of Job. Right now, plans for publication are still somewhat up in the air, but I did include the 3 crow song stories in Delta of Cassiopeia. And I'd like to read from the story The Cold, Dark March to Winter. And the Crow Song stories, by and large, are set in the 1950s. Kind of 1957 was the year I had in mind, although some of the stories a little earlier, some a little later. But if you think of 1957-ish as the time period, that certainly will work. And in the novel, there were 3 teenage, young ladies who became important characters in the book. There is Rebecca and her friend Shirley, who have been best friends for ages in this small Midwestern town. But then recently, another young lady has moved to town named Francine, but she goes by Frankie. And she and Rebecca become really close friends really quickly, and in essence, kind of shut Shirley out. And so that tension creates some of the narrative tension in the novel as a whole. And there are a few stories where I kind of use that as the focus of the narrative, and this story is one of them. But actually, the main character of this story is a school librarian named Beth Ann Ferguson. And as the story begins, we discover that the English teacher in the school is planning the school play, which is going to be a kind of a potpourri of scenes from Shakespeare. And she has asked Beth Ann to help these 3 young ladies with their scene that they're going to be performing in the play, which is the scene from Macbeth of the 3 witches. And so I think that's enough to kind of understand what's happening as the story begins. The story is a little bit on the adult side, a little bit risque, so just a kind of a little bit of a warning for anyone who might be watching this video with, an audience that you may not want to watch with in those regards, or to watch at work or something like that. Why are you watching a video at work? That's another question. But anyway, not really far out there in terms of risqueness, but a little bit. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Again, this is The Cold, Dark March to Winter. "When shall we 4 meet again?" asked Rebecca. "That's my line, sort of." Shirley smacked her on the arm with a copy of the play. "After school tomorrow," suggested Miss Ferguson. "We could bring our lunches to the library," said Frankie. "Go over some ideas." Beth Ann normally ate in the teacher's lounge, but it always required an effort to be gregarious, plus a break from the cigarette smoke was welcome. "All right, at lunch then." Thanks, Miss Ferguson, chimed the three girls as they gathered their books and coats. You'd better put those on. There's definitely a nip in the air. Apparently, the almanac is calling for an early snow, said Beth Ann, realizing how old fashioned it made her sound, how out of touch. She wasn't much older than her novice thespians, who would be graduating after spring term. Graduating to what? Their options were the same as when she'd graduated 5 years earlier: marriage and motherhood, or business school in Crawford to study typing, filing, and shorthand, or some truly mindless work and wage earning. Beth Ann Ferguson, who'd always preferred books to people, charted a different path by taking a correspondence course in library science and being available when the former school librarian retired after more than 40 years among the musty stacks. Beth Ann couldn't imagine herself doing this or anything for 40 years. She lived across the street from the school with her mother in the only home Beth Ann had ever known, so the turn in weather was of little consequence to her. From the library's window, she watched the girls depart for their homes, and shortly they were lost from view. A pickup truck turned onto the street, Mr. Abernathy's, she knew without even thinking about it, and in its headlamp beams she saw a cyclonic swirl of leaves stirred by a gust of wind and the truck's accelerating wheels. Her mother would be keeping dinner for her, soup and a sandwich, but Beth Ann decided to linger a bit. There were books she could reshelve, and perhaps there were resources that could assist her contribution to the winter play. Mrs. Wilson, the upper grades English teacher, had decided to do what she called scenes from Shakespeare: Hamlet's Poor Yorick speech, Romeo and Juliet's garden scene, Henry V's once more unto the breach rallying cry, Lady Macbeth's distressed sleepwalking, and so on. And she'd asked Beth Ann to help with the Weird Sisters incantation scene. Annette Wilson had been directing the school's student productions for years, but this was by far the most ambitious. It would have been surprising, except that something had been changing in Mrs. Wilson, something difficult to define, a greater confidence combined with a more pacific calm. Her husband had left her, according to village gossip, but instead of being devastated, she was crystallizing into a new person. By the way, another story in this collection, Vox Humana, focuses actually on Annette Wilson and her situation of being left by her husband, etc. So the stories all kind of tie together in that way. But back to this story. Beth Ann envied Annette's dawning independence. She felt trapped in the shell of her personality, tied to being the person she'd always been, held back from becoming someone else, someone she didn't even know yet, of whom, in fact, she could barely detect an indistinct silhouette, like a shadow fallen across the walk behind her. She went to the stack of books on her desk, about a dozen titles to be replaced to the shelves. The desk was an enormous hardwood sentinel by the door, and when Beth Ann sat at it, she knew it added to the impression of her being a child still. Just shy of 5 feet when standing barefoot, Beth Ann dressed like the dowdiest grandmother in the village, always in dark dresses or a white blouse with a dark skirt while at school, even a ubiquitous string of faux pearls, all to project the image and authority of someone older. She sometimes wondered if the style of dress only gave the suggestion of a child playing at dress-up. By the time she finished reshelving the books, rain had begun streaking the library's windows. Her mother would be listening for her at the kitchen door. She felt a pang of guilt at keeping her mother waiting, and a simultaneous twinge of irritation at her mother's fretful attention. Beth Ann opened the door to the small office directly behind the desk. She shut the door and locked it before switching on the light. There were no windows. There was a rolling chair a little taller than a milking stool, shelving on one wall, and a trio of metal filing cabinets, all locked. Beth Ann wore a wire bracelet on her wrist that held a dozen keys like charms. She slipped the bracelet from her hand and used one of its smallest keys to unlock the middle filing cabinet, whose drawers were labeled Requisitions 1948 to 50, 1951 to 53, and 1954 to 56. She pulled out the top drawer, extending it as far as it would go. In the back of the heavy drawer, under an old leather-bound ledger, was a metal cash box. Beth sat and placed the cash box on her lap, then used another key to unlock it. On top of the box's contents was a stack of yellowed ledger sheets. Beneath the sheets was a small black book, another kind of ledger, and on its cover was written Discretionary Funds 1898 to 1901. Between the pages of the old book was a photograph of a woman that Beth Ann hid there. Her pale skin glowed like sun-drenched petals. Her hair was as dark as night dropped down a well. But it was her patch of black which most magnetized Beth Ann. When she was 12, Beth Ann and her parents visited an ancient relative who lived in a town halfway to Danville. The old man sat in a chair the entire visit, buried in hand-knitted rugs, coughing and wheezing and dying. Bored, Beth Ann snooped in the upstairs bedrooms. In the bottom drawer of an antique bureau, she found the set of startling photographs. Her first impulse was to turn away, but they had instantly bewitched her. She'd never stolen anything before, yet she couldn't completely part with these hypnotizingly sordid images, so she slipped one of the sepia prints out of her dying relative's house. Over the years, she lived with the fear of having the picture discovered by her parents. When she was hired as the school librarian, a position which came with locking doors and cabinets and cash boxes, she decided the safest thing was to keep the picture here, where, if discovered, a long ago predecessor could be implied, adding another mark of deceitfulness to the array of sins the pictured woman had caused her to commit over the years. Beth Ann was compelled to dig out the old photograph because of the girl Frankie. Being around her set off the same kinds of feelings as the photo did, sparked the same sorts of thoughts. The compulsion was amplified by the bond that obviously existed between Frankie and Rebecca, a bond Shirley sensed too, and one which provoked a jealousy in Shirley that filled the space around the three girls like a seeping gas. Beth Ann gazed at the photograph until the woman's white flesh and black patch were freshly imprinted on her mind's eye. Then she shut off the light, hoping to keep what came next, and the shame of it, a secret from even herself. She tried to will it otherwise, but the woman's face, the woman's flesh, became Frankie's, the woman's black patch. When Beth Ann arrived at school, Frankie was waiting in the hall outside the library door. "Good morning," said Beth Ann, trying not to sound self-conscious as she slipped off the wire of keys to unlock the door. "Good morning. Sorry to be lying in wait, but I finished Silas Marner and want to check out the mill on the Floss." "You've developed a taste for George Eliot." Beth Ann opened the door and had Frankie go in first. "I have. I was up too late finishing it, but I couldn't help myself." Frankie set Silas Marner on Miss Ferguson's desk. "I'm afraid I may be falling asleep in Mr. Henderson's class," she said confidentially. "Not a fan of proofs and theorems?" Beth Ann turned on the light switch. "They're okay." Frankie was making her way toward the mill on the Floss. "But it's right before lunch, and Mr. H's teaching manner is very calming." "That's a good word." Beth Ann placed her sack lunch in the bottom drawer of the desk. She thought of the woman in the picture perched on the edge of an elegant drawing-room settee. She thought of Frankie perching on the settee, which she always imagined was crimson, with gold tassels dangling from its upholstered arms. "I usually have time to read in Mrs. Wilson's class and Mrs. Messmore's sometimes. I want to be prepared just in case." Frankie set the heavy book on Beth Ann's desk. Beth Ann pulled out her chair. A thick cushion raised her to a workable height. She advanced the date on the stamper while Frankie wrote her name on the book's card. "It hasn't been checked out for more than 5 years," she said. "I always feel a bit sad for books if no one has read them for a while." Frankie's dark hair was shorter than most girls and swept over to one side, rather boyishly. It often hung down and obscured one eye, which somehow intensified the pristine green of the one in view, the one which had a way of both demanding Beth Ann's attention and diverting it away. No other student, no other person, had ever evoked such a confusion of feelings in her. Beth Ann stamped the card and the due date slip in the book. "I know what you mean." 2 weeks, she said, like always. Frankie blew on the wet ink a moment before closing the cover. 2 weeks, she repeated. "Thanks, Miss Ferguson." The door opened. "There you are," said Rebecca. "We're going to be late." She smiled hello at Miss Ferguson and took Frankie by the arm. Bookworm, she said to the librarian. There are worse things, said Beth Ann. Have a good day, ladies. The pair shut the door as they hurried off. The noise of children rushing and chattering in the hallway spiked for a moment as Rebecca came and went. Beth Ann touched the cover of Silas Marner, where many fingers had worn the cloth shiny. All right, I'm going to stop there. That's just the beginning of the story, The Cold, Dark March to Winter. But that's a little bit about my new book, Delta of Cassiopeia. Again, a collection of 20 stories and 12 sonnets available in hardcover and Kindle editions. I appreciate your watching the video, and hopefully I will see you down at the digital trail one way or another.